the Irish American Writers and Artists, you'll be most welcome to join us. We are not Irish, really. We are not American. What we are concentrating on mostly is your artistry. So songsters, guitar players, dancers, painters, poets, and novelists. Any art that you have, you are welcome. So our business is love of art, love of each other, and have love, life, laughter.
Céad Míle Fáilte. Welcome to Irish American Writers and Artists Association Centenary Salon. I'm Seán O'Dowd, Treasurer of the organization, and your host this afternoon/evening. While Easter is clearly a special time to many within the Irish and Irish American communities, this time of year carries a certain level of significance as we reflect upon the brave men and women who fought and sacrificed during the Irish War of Independence. Without these heroes, people like myself would not be able to hold up one of these. This afternoon, you're going to be hearing from a number of folks, academics, historians, musicians, and actors, all of whom are going to celebrate a reflection of 100 years in their own personal way. Enjoy.
Banachtaí na Cas go Díobh. I'm Máirtín Ó Muilleoir, publisher of the Irish Echo, and I send Easter greetings to our friends in the Irish American Writers and Artists Group. Looking back 100 years, it's almost for our family like very recent history, because on the 11th of May 22, just after the birth of both states in reality, my grandfather Tommy was shot and wounded in an attack by a B Special gang on his home in South Derry. His brother Frank, standing beside him, was grievously wounded. His youngest brother James was shot dead in that same raid. So this time, this centenary, is a very important period for our family, because we believe strongly that the freedom of the Free State was bought with the sacrifice of the McCune brothers and a fourth brother who was later imprisoned on the Argenta prison ship. They were all strong Michael Collins men, and their sacrifice enabled the Free State to get the freedom that it enjoyed and that the Republic of Ireland enjoys today. And I mention that because on the Sunday before the 11th of May, the extended McCune, Miller and Ó Muilleoir families will gather in South Derry to unveil a headstone on the grave of James McCune. And we do so with no bitterness, no rancour, no thoughts of vengeance, but only in communion, with compassion, with kindness, with togetherness, with the belief that as long as your name is mentioned, you're not dead. And we'll celebrate the short life of James McCune and reflect on that 100-year journey since then. And part of that reflection is looking optimistically ahead to the freedom of our country, to equality for all our people. And that, friends, with a nod to Paradise Square, makes me remember a song which is very important to us today, who are continuing always to move forward here. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking. Gonna build a brave new world. You weren't expecting that. Slán go fóill.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome to our discussion today, which is focused on Irish revolutionary Maud Gonne, Dr. Christine Kinealy, who is a historian and expert as it relates to Gordamore and a host of related topics. Dr. Kinealy is a professor and head of Irish Studies at Quinnipiac University. She is also author of countless books, many of which are in my home office here. I should also mention that Christine has received numerous awards over the years. Three that I would like to point out are as follows. Woman of the Year by Irish America Heritage and Culture Committee, Department of Education, inducted into Irish America Hall of Fame, William Butler Yeats Award for Literary Achievement. So when I think of Maud Gonne, I think of, one of the key patriots of the Irish Rising, Yeats's muse, and so forth. but there's so much to her. I guess, Christine, one of the questions I had is, prior to the Rising, what was her role with regards to the famines and evictions occurring in the 1890s?
Yeah, her role, I think, has been slightly underplayed and underforgotten by historians, particularly male historians, unfortunately. Her role is multifaceted, and she lived a long time. She was born 1866. She died 1953. So her period covers a very long time. But in the 19th century, she was very involved in the late 1880s and the 1890s in various campaigns against evictions. We know that evictions did not end with the Great Hunger. We know that famines did not end with the Great Hunger. And she was a young woman, being born in England, brought to Ireland with her father, who was in the army, and just really reconnected with her Irish roots. And she travelled to the west of Ireland in the late 1880s and 1890s, and she spoke out against evictions. And it was sort of remarkable because there was this young, very beautiful woman, 6 foot tall, so stood out in a crowd, renowned for her beauty from a very early age, had an English accent, was not married, and yet here she is, allowed to share the platform with many prominent home rulers, many prominent politicians, and she makes speeches that are recorded in the newspapers, very forcefully talking out about evictions and famines and how they are proof that British involvement in Ireland needs to end. So very early on, a champion of the poor people of Ireland.
So is it true that during Queen Victoria's last visit to Ireland in 1900 that Maud Gonne had dubbed her the Famine Queen in an art she wrote, and what was the public's reaction to that?
So it's an interesting one. So Maud Gonne, again, a brilliant young woman. She'd also been raised in France. She spoke fluent French. She lived part of her time in London, in Paris, and in Dublin. So again, a very cosmopolitan figure. And she was very concerned by the frequency of famines in Ireland. In 1898, she'd actually travelled to Mayo and helped the people there. She, again, was very militant, and she told them to resist being evicted. She argued, as Speranza had done in 1847, it's better and more noble to die by the sword than to die of starvation. And what's really interesting to me is often Maud Gonne is defined through men in her life. She's defined as the muse, the beautiful muse of the poet W.B. Yeats, as the wife of Sean McBride, who was executed in 1916, and not a happy marriage, unfortunately. And then later on, she was defined as the mother of Sean McBride, who is pretty famous for the McBride Principles. But to me, one of her more interesting relationships is with James Connolly, the great nationalist and socialist. And when she heard about the famine that was persisting throughout the west of Ireland in 1898, she and James Connolly got together and wrote a really powerful polemic on the rights of property and the rights of man. And they very much inverted the role of the churches by saying, God does not want people to die of starvation. It's better to die fighting for your life than just to die ignobly of famine. And so 1898, she went to Mayo, James Connolly went to Kerry. They collaborated on a number of other programmes, including in, as you say, 1900, when Queen Victoria visited Ireland. And Queen Victoria had been queen at that stage for a very long time. I think she came to the throne 1838. So she was the monarch at the time of the Great Hunger. And when she came to Ireland for her fourth and final time in 1900, Maud Gonne wrote an article, initially in French. She had started her own newspaper in France, and then it was translated into English and printed in the United Irishman on the 8th of April 1900. The British authorities were not too pleased, and they banned it, and they tried to seize all copies, but of course some survived. And the article is called The Famine Queen, and that is a name that has really stuck to Queen Victoria. And in it, she castigates Queen Victoria both as a monarch and as a woman for being head of this vast, rich empire, yet allowing hundreds and thousands of her people to die as she presided over it. And again, very powerful polemic. And Maud Gonne says, as you near the end of your life, you must tremble knowing what you have to face when you die. And so it's something that The name Famine Queen has stuck, but it actually originated with Maud Gonne in 1900.
Interesting. It's my understanding that Maud Gonne was a lifelong activist as it related to women's rights. How influential was she in bringing on board other women to the Irish cause prior to the Rising and afterwards?
Yeah, again, one of the, I suppose, problems with history is often it's written by men, often it's written by the victors, and women have so often, as we call it, been airbrushed out of history. We know the very famous example is Nurse O'Farrell, who actually, at the end of the Easter Rising, delivered to the British Army, at great risk to herself, the peace, the desire for peace by Patrick Pearse and his followers. And she was told she had to go back, return with Patrick Pearse, which again she did at great risk to herself. A photograph was taken, and in all subsequent photographs, she literally was airbrushed out, and her story has only recently been recovered. And that's not unusual, that women have been either written out of history or relegated to the role of auxiliaries. And it's only in recent years that they have been put back into history and their stories recovered. And we know this from 1798, and Devlin was described as being a servant of some of the leaders. We know she was an equal to these leaders. So again, it's been a slow process, but it is happening. And Maud Gonne was part of a generation of really remarkable women. Countess Markievicz is probably the most famous, Hannah She Skeffington, Helena Maloney, etc., etc. And these women were brave. They really transcended any limitations put on them by class, by gender, by nationality. And also what they do, they combine their nationalism with a quest for social justice and with feminism. And this is pretty advanced. At this stage, women didn't even have the vote. But again, in history, they're relegated as being secondary to the men. Maud Gonne, I would argue, was second to no man. She was a brilliant writer, a brilliant activist, a brilliant strategist. And in 1900, when Queen Victoria was visiting Ireland, the authorities in Dublin Castle said, let's have a children's picnic to celebrate the visit of the monarch. And so Maud Gonne got together a group of women, and they said, well, if Queen's doing that, we'll do our own alternative picnic. And in the end, they had a picnic for 30,000 children in the Dublin area. It was amazing. They raised the money for that. They organised the logistics. They had a trip out to Wolfe Tone's burial site. So it was combined a lot of different factors. But as a result of that gathering of these women and this idea of how to speak up against the Queen's visit, Maud Gonne came up with the idea with some of the other women, let's have a permanent women's organisation. And so in 1900, she founded the Daughters of Ireland, one of the earliest all-women organisations in the world, never mind in Ireland. And so in that sense, she was very important for giving women a voice and giving women an agency. And if I can just say how it really is relevant, the role of these incredible women. In 1916, when the proclamation was designed and composed, the first three words of the proclamation are Irish men and Irish women. It is the first revolutionary document in the world to describe women as being the equals to men. And that language is used throughout the document. So again, very, very powerful. And I don't believe that would have happened unless these incredible women had been such great activists for many, many decades. And just the sad ending to that is when the Constitution was drawn up in 1937, it talks about women's place being in the home. And of course, Maud Gonne and other women spoke out. And I think it was Maud Gonne who said, why do men fear women so much? And it's a great question.
Wow, I didn't know that. After the treaty was signed in 1921, Maud Gonne was on the anti-treaty side. Please describe her activities during this period of, let's say, 1921 to 22, including her association with Women's Peace Committee.
Yeah, so many of these women I've talked about opposed the treaty. Their argument was, we haven't given our lives and fought for 700 years for this partial form of independence. People who supported the treaty, of course led by Michael Collins, said, well, after 700 years, it's more than we've had before, and this is a starting point. But the two sides really disagreed and very much pitted against two very different personalities of Michael Collins on one side and Eamon de Valera on the other side. And we know the tragic consequence of that was the Civil War. So brother against brother, comrade against comrade, people who'd fought together for years against British oppression were now killing each other. And Maud Gonne and a number of the other women just really felt this was senseless. Why are we killing each other? We are not the real enemies. Surely we have to find some middle ground. And so they formed this peace committee, and they approached some of the leaders, and they asked both sets of leaders, would they have a truce? And both sets of leaders seemed to be very reluctant to do that. And in the end, it didn't happen in that way. But again, it just showed you the vision of these women who who saw the senselessness of Irish people killing each other. And again, during this period, Maud Gonne, like other women, was imprisoned for her activities, ironically imprisoned by people who were her colleagues not so long before. And we know that women, again, pioneered the use of hunger strikes, something that is very much part of ancient Irish tradition, part of the Breton laws, and these women, again, pioneered it. So these women were fearless.
Well, many of us know of Maud Gonne. Do you believe that her legacy in the present day is as full and as well known as it should be? I mean, in my research leading up to this discussion, I was surprised that no one's made a feature-length movie about her. I mean, is that something that you believe could or should happen?
I would love her to be better known. I would love her to be better respected for what she did, because something I haven't really spoke about, but she was very active about evictions, the Salon, but also she was, from the late 19th century, a great advocate of the political rights of Irish prisoners, particularly those who were incarcerated in Britain. She believed that they had to be recognised as political prisoners. And as someone who lived through the hunger strikes, I'm very familiar with those arguments. But she was making them 100 years earlier, and that was very, very influential. So I think for a number of reasons, she definitely should be better remembered. In her own right, in the support she gave to other women, to other men, for her vision, for her compassion. And she and Countess Markievicz and James Connolly, they understood the poverty, the deep poverty of the people in Ireland. They opened soup kitchens on the streets of Dublin. So across a whole range of issues, I think she deserves to be remembered. She was beautiful, as we know. I would not like it to be the Hollywood treatment of just glamorizing her and focusing on her beauty, because again, her beauty went a lot deeper than what was visible. But I do think we need to honor the women in our history and the women who made such great sacrifices. So yes, I would love to see her honored, and a film might be the right way to do it, but certainly she and other women deserve to be written back into history as the equals, if not the superiors, of the men.
Let's hope that comes about. And my last discussion points, would you mind describing, I know you referenced it earlier, but would you mind describing her relationship with her son Seán, who was an active IRA member and then went on to become Irish Foreign Minister and also one of the founders of Amnesty International?
Yeah, so Maud had quite a turbulent personal life. I told you she had great associations with France. While she was a young woman in France, she fell in love with a married man. He was quite an odd character in many ways, quite right-wing, but she was in love with him. They had a son, Georges, who sadly died. They conceived a daughter, Isolde. So by the standards of the time, this was very, very shocking. And the children were brought up in France and they were kept secret. At some point, Maud told Yeats about them, but essentially they were a secret. But during a tour of America, Maud Gonne met a hero of the Boer War, Sean McBride. He had fought in the Boer War in South Africa against the British. And he was touring America and Maud Gonne was there. They were trying to raise funds for the 1798 commemoration, etc. He was not a great speaker, although he was a hero. She was a brilliant speaker, and people came to hear her speak. And they formed a relationship. They got married in 1903, and a year later, Seán was born. Unfortunately, the marriage was deeply, deeply unhappy, and Maud did something that was extremely brave in the context of the time. She filed for a divorce, and A, a woman divorcing a man, and B, an Irish woman divorcing an Irish hero was really unheard of. And a lot of people turned their backs on Maud Gonne at that point. And she stayed increasingly in France, partly because she didn't want Seán to be taken by his father. In 1916, Maud was in France for all those reasons. And John McBride was executed in 1916, not because he played a major part in it, largely vindictiveness for his role in the Boer War. So at that point, Maud felt she could come back to Ireland safely, and she could bring her two children, Isolde and Seán. And what's very clear is that these two children followed Maud to all her political activities. And again, during this turbulent period, she was very interested and involved and a champion of the rights of political prisoners. And I would say that Seán learned about the rights of political prisoners from his mother. And so it's no coincidence that later on he forms Amnesty International. What's really interesting, it's almost an incarceration of an earlier form of amnesty, because during the Fenian uprisings in the 1860s, Isaac Butt, a Protestant unionist lawyer, became a nationalist. And when he saw how political prisoners, how the Fenians, like O'Donnell and Rossa, were so badly treated, he at that stage formed Amnesty. So the very first form of amnesty starts in Ireland in the 1860s, and then a century later, it's revived by Seán McBride, Maud's son.
Wow. So Christine, thank you so much for your time and insight today. I hope the folks listen to the salon learn as much as I did. I thought I had a decent handle on who Maud was, but clearly not. So thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome.
Uprising, which is 106 years ago this week. And God bless those patriots that gave us a better Ireland, and hopefully one day there'll be a free Ireland. So this is video live for the Irish American Writers and Artists Association. And it's a song is Foggy Dew while our patriots were fighting, while World War I was going on. We had our patriots fighting the Brits back in Ireland. So we'll give it a go. Up the rebels.
Welcome, everybody. Reflections on Easter 1922 in Ireland. I have with me today Dr. Conor McNamara and Dr. Siobhra Aiken. I will hand it over to them to let them explain their bios, and we'll kick it off. Siobhra?
Okay, I'll start then. Thanks so much, Seán, for having me, and thanks, Conor. My name is Siobhra Aiken, and I'm a lecturer in Queen's University in Belfast. And my recent research on the Civil War focuses on trauma and testimony and veterans' writings. My book was published just about a month ago. It's called Spiritual Wounds, Trauma, Testimony and the Irish Civil War by Irish Academic Press. So I'm particularly interested in the memory and the legacies of the Irish Civil War.
And Conor?
Yeah, Conor. I'm the last couple of years the historian for County Galway, Galway County Council, and I've my own research is the War of Independence and the Civil War in the west of Ireland, and also the Republican leadership in the Civil War. So my last book was also, like Siobhra, with Irish Academic Press, Liam Mello, Soldier of the Irish Republic, who was executed at the height of the Civil War, a study of his collected writings. So a similar enough area of interest to Siobhra.
Terrific. So as we reflect back 100 years, so the consolidation of the Northern States established in 1920, and what was the impact, would you say, on the nationalist community at that time?
Well, the Northern State is established in 1920 under the Government of Ireland Act, in the midst of the War of Independence, which rages across Ireland, but is most intense at the south, southwest, I suppose, and the west. So if you like, the Northern State has 2 years to consolidate itself before the Free State comes into being in 1922. For the nationalist minority, the Catholic minority, it's around 33%, particularly in Belfast, parts of Derry City, South Armagh. It's a disastrous period, actually, of atrocity, essentially. We have two periods of intense violence in the summer of 1920 and again in March until June of 1922, where you have over 500 people killed, actually over 550 in Belfast alone, in these two intense periods of sectarian violence. And what you have essentially is many of the places and the names that are familiar from the most recent troubles, if you like, the outer neighbourhoods of Belfast city centre. Short Strand, a Catholic enclave in the east, Ardoyne in the north, New Lodge, the Antrim Road, and the Springfield Road in the Upper Falls. These are the Catholic enclaves of Belfast. And the period, I suppose, of tragedy commences with the shipyard expulsions in the summer of 1920, where eventually over 20,000 Catholics over those 2 years, the Catholic Relief Association of Belfast estimated, were driven from their jobs, most famously, of course, in the Harland and Wolff shipyards. This is followed then by waves of loyalist attacks on Catholic neighbourhoods. This really reaches its peak, actually, 100 years ago in March of 1920. Perhaps the most dreadful tragedy of the entire period is the Weaver Street Massacre. It's actually 13th of February 1922. 4 girls, young girls and 2 women are killed in a playground in North Belfast, just between the Antrim Road and the Shore Road. It's now, the street has been demolished, Weaver Street. Believed a bomb thrown by off-duty members of the B Specials, the reserve police force of Northern Ireland, which becomes infamous for its anti-Catholic massacres. No one's ever arrested for it. It's followed up very shortly afterwards by the McMahon family murder, maybe about a kilometre away or less on the other side of the Antrim Road. 6 members of the McMahon family, Catholics, publicans, are killed in their home. Again, that massacre is believed to be led by a DI in the police force, District Inspector John Nixon, who's widely believed to control a secret organisation in Belfast of committed to killing Catholics, particularly in North Belfast, where much of this violence occurs. Nixon himself is awarded an MBE by the British government a year after the massacre, actually, and is an MP until his death in 1949. So for Catholics in vulnerable areas where there's traditionally, and quite a number of Protestants also died in this violence, this communal violence also has to be pointed out. It's a period of I think, helplessness, essentially, and I think a deep feeling, I think, of betrayal, actually, by the Catholic establishment or the nationalist community in what becomes the 26 counties, that they're essentially being left to their fate. And I think this is still a key part of Catholic identity in parts, particularly in Belfast and also Derry and elsewhere, that they were left, if you like, defenceless in the midst of the establishment of the Free State.
So, Conor, what I'm hearing is basically, would you say that the Irish Republican Army at the time wasn't really there to defend them in an effective manner? Siobhra, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, so really interesting, Conor. I think it's interesting actually to start this discussion by thinking of those events in Belfast 100 years ago, particularly as Conor mentioned, Weaver Street, and also the killings of the McMahon family. Because even in the Centenary's programme, and I'm based in Belfast, so I can see this, I suppose, there is still a discomfort around commemorating these events, and actually very little commemoration relative to maybe some other events. And it really just shows you that that these legacies are still living on, and there's still very much a discomfort around it. So in terms of the IRA, then I suppose there's a few things to to say about the IRA and trying to understand their role, particularly in the North in this period. The first thing is that there's a trouble in terms of documentation, and that we don't have the same amount of material about the Northern divisions, and that's related to a number of issues. For example, we possibly have less pension applications to the Southern government for pension recognition. These are being released and available online, and they've been hugely valuable for many historians. And there's even speculation that in the 1930s, when Northern volunteers were applying for the pensions, there is a case at least where the post was actually interfered with, and there was a fear, therefore, of disclosing the activity that they've been involved in the 1920s, because they're still living under a government that is essentially very hostile, and that this was something that still that couldn't necessarily be talked about openly. So we have less documentation, and then in major commemorative projects like the Bureau of Military History, we have less representation from Northern volunteers in the IRA. So that poses a problem, I suppose, from a historian's perspective in grappling with that and trying to understand that. But in terms of that, how effective were the IRA, we have to remember that the Catholic nationalist community were very much in a minority. And what's interesting too is it's not always on religious divides either. Conor mentioned there that the expulsions from the shipyards occurred in July 1920. The expulsions were of Catholic workers, but also workers who had any kind of socialist or trade unionist tendencies, and they included Protestant workers as well. And we even have cases where Protestants were members of the IRA in Belfast in the North as well. So that there are some exceptions, I suppose, to that. It's not always a very clear-cut line. But in terms of the IRA, then what we really see is that the IRA, with partition, that the Northern IRA aren't given a huge amount of support from the IRA in the South, from general headquarters in Dublin. And we see this around the signing of the treaty. There is a sense when the treaty is signed that among many volunteers, in any case, that the treaty will be a stepping stone, and this would be Michael Collins's argument, that this was a stepping stone in order to secure down the line a 32 county republic. And we see actually that a lot of Northern volunteers are pro-treaty. They actually support the treaty under the belief that this will achieve a republic further down the line. And there's also talk around the signing of the treaty of a Northern offensive, that Michael Collins is preparing to attack the North, to reclaim the North for the Catholic and nationalist minority. But that really proves to be a disaster. It's called off last minute. Only one division, the 1st Northern Division, participate in that Northern offensive, and really they do not have the resources to pose any sort of challenge against the newly founded Northern Irish state, which are much more strongly equipped and have much better, I suppose, in terms of policing, that they have more numbers and also more arms and more resources.
That's interesting, Siobhra. kind of turning towards that, turning south, I guess, if you will, with the foundation of the Free State as a dominion of the British Commonwealth. It's something that we, at least I don't focus on a great deal when looking back at Irish history. Can we talk about, both you and Conor, sort of, about that idea when it was first established?
Well, I suppose, Seán, the first thing is to state that the Irish Republican Army in the War of Independence are committed to the achievement of this, if you like, theoretical republic, established ideological republic at Easter week 1916. And for Republican diehard leaders in the IRA like Liam Mellows and others, there is this very firm commitment to this idea that a republic has been declared, but it simply needs to be established, and that they're giving their allegiance to this republic in waiting. So whether that's realistic or not, and it probably is far from realistic in terms of the ability of the IRA to bring about that level of concession from the British, is, it's not in question that the British would be willing to commit to agreeing to the establishment of a republic, quite frankly. But the dominion status that the treaty sets up, in other words, is a long way from the aims of the IRA and the Republican leadership. It is very, very much a concession and a very moderate step towards independence. It also de facto is an admittance, an acceptance almost of partition. Well, very much an acceptance of partition. And I think what it really highlights is, amongst would say the more committed cadre of officers and leaders in Cumann na mBan in particular, actually, the women's organization, and Siobhra can speak to this, is a betrayal of the ideals of Easter week, and also I think a betrayal of the Republican dead. And this idea that the dead have been betrayed, who sacrificed their lives for the establishment of a dominion in the British Commonwealth, as really throwing into question the whole point, really, of the Republican campaign, to achieve such a moderate step towards independence. And of course, the counter-argument to that, of course, is Michael Collins' very vague and Siobhra brought it up there, notion that this is a stepping stone and the North will be addressed and we will overcome the difficulties if we establish this foothold towards independence. I would suggest that in many ways, this notion that we would deal with the North, I think, is a very strong idea once we have our limited independence. Is more a smokescreen than anything else. I don't think Collins, I would genuinely believe, or any of the Republican leadership, bar a very small number, had any real intention of ever taking up arms against the northern state, which is ironic, as we'll come to, because many of them are very ready and do take up arms against each other. So whilst we have a beleaguered Catholic community in parts of the North, as we'll talk about, we have the Republican leadership enveloping upon itself. And the civil war that's going to emerge is really a war of atrocity of one Republican side against the other, with very little, if any, concern whatsoever to events in the 6 counties.
So what we're getting into the Civil War a little bit. So we have De Valera with Michael Collins. How are they sort of trying to build support for themselves and for their different groups at this time? Siobhra?
So Seán, I suppose just to give a bit of the context of that is that the treaty is signed in London, and then it's brought back to the Dáil to be voted on. And as Conor said, there was huge debates in the Dáil within the elected politicians of the Dáil regarding the treaty. And there was huge outcry, as it happens, among the female TDs. All 6 female TDs in the Dáil rejected the treaty. Nevertheless, it was ratified by the Dáil by a small minority. I have it written down just to always check: 64 votes in favour and 57 opposed. So the treaty, therefore, is accepted by the political establishment. But the problem there is, if we think of the wider Republican movement, that the Republican movement wasn't just the political wing. Sinn Féin, who were elected in 1918 and were in the Dáil, were the political wing of the Republican movement, but there was also the IRA. And as Conor mentioned, there was real unease with the treaty, particularly in the IRA, who felt that this was not following the republic that had been proclaimed in 1916, and that they were loyal not to the politicians of Sinn Féin, but rather to the republic that had been declared earlier. So in terms of the main leaders, you mentioned De Valera and Michael Collins, they really become the figures of the two opposing sides. I think we have to think of that, if we take a step back for that, we said that there was a lot of other aspects at play, but oftentimes the Civil War is portrayed as a battle of two personalities. I think that's maybe a little bit reductionist, but in any case, Eamon De Valera is to the fore in rejecting the terms of the treaty, and calling for an alternative. He proposes another document number 2 of what he would suggest could be accepted, although that for some people that wouldn't have been much different from what had been offered in the treaty. And as we mentioned, then Michael Collins was in London, signs the treaty himself. There was a lot of I suppose hullabaloo over whether he should have signed it without consulting with Eamon De Valera and so on. We won't be able to go into all of that, but he definitely felt that this was a stepping stone, something that would need to be taken in order to maybe push for further independence after that. And we have to consider too that there was looming over all of this, there was the threat of further British aggression. So there is that threat that if this isn't accepted, that this will lead to much more violence, and that the IRA at this stage didn't have the means to continue possibly or to defend themselves if that threat was realised. And Michael Collins does have a strong following, particularly among IRA men in Dublin who'd been involved in the squad, and oftentimes they would have said what is good enough for Mick is good enough for me. He was very respected as a personality, so for that reason he has a strong following on the pro-treaty side. So they are I suppose the two main sides and perspectives on the treaty. But what happens then that leads to civil war is that a number of the anti-treaty IRA decide to occupy a number of locations around Dublin, including the forecourts. And I think it was actually today, 100 years ago, when they decided to occupy these buildings. And they're actually occupying the buildings in order to put it up to the British, who were still in Dublin at the time. So you have to remember that there's still British soldiers that were in Dublin. And they were, I suppose, trying to antagonise the British. And there was a hope maybe that if the British were to attack them, that would maybe reunite the split within the IRA and maybe impel or set off another war against the British. However, that's not necessarily how it transpired. And we do have to think as well that the North was somewhat tied into this. So what happens in Dublin around this time, and I'll finish up because I know I've gone too long, but during all this period, in Dublin in early 1922, there are many Catholic refugees from Belfast in Dublin, and actually the pro and anti-treaty sides are nearly competing to accommodate these refugees. And there's also attempts to galvanise support for a northern offensive. And what happens is we have a Dublin volunteer, a number of Dublin volunteers go to a car dealers, and it was a Protestant-owned car dealers, and as part of the Belfast boycott, they were trying to, I suppose, attack and to undermine businesses in the south that were supporting Protestants in the north, and they stole a number of cars from this car dealer, and that led to the arrest of the anti-treaty IRA who'd been involved in this, and as a result of that, the anti-treaty IRA kidnapped pro-treaty IRA man Ginger O'Connell, and that was really one of the sparks that led to the pro-treaty IRA attacking the anti-treaty IRA who were in the forecourts. And there was also another factor in that, and that was the assassination of Sir Henry Wilson in London. It was assassinated by the IRA in London. He was part of the British government, but he was also implicated in some of the atrocities, or seen to be implicated in some of the atrocities in the north as part of the pogroms. So he's assassinated, possibly on the orders of Michael Collins. So what we see is all these factors collide, that the British government then, on the back of the assassination of Sir Henry Wilson, put pressure on the pro-treaty IRA to deal with the anti-treaty IRA who are in the forecourt. And then there's also the kidnapping of Ginger O'Connell within all of that, and that I suppose adds further petrol to the fire, and that leads to the shelling of the forecourts then in June 1922.
So pro-treaty, anti-treaty sides, explain what was going on in Ireland. You know, across the Atlantic, over here in the US, particularly probably in the Northeast, what were the views of each side, and what was going on, fundraising and so forth?
Well, the American wing, or the Irish American wing, I suppose, of the revolutionary movement is Clan na Gael, of course, the family of the Irish, centered around John Devoy and some other powerful figures in New York and in the northeastern cities, Philadelphia, of course, Joe McGarrity, the two twin strongholds of Clan na Gael, and it's an interesting position. They are very much Republican in their outlook, and the treaty is widely rejected, not universally, but quite strongly in Irish America. And Irish America is fundamental, and still is, as you know as well as anyone, Seán, in events at home. It's particularly important for a number of reasons. To get political support and recognition for the Republic was a long-term aim from the Wilson government in particular earlier, and from later governments, to get political support. America was a republic. The Irish Republicans are striving for similar political status, so therefore it makes logical sense as the way they're trying to buy support from the US administration. But secondly, of course, practical support in terms of guns and in terms of money, principally. And if you look throughout the Republican campaign, but it begins really in 1916, and it's relevant in later eras, since 1970s, 80s, and 90s also, is the centrality of Irish American dollars to not just the political or military campaign, but I would say more so to families of the Republican bereaved. If you go through the papers, the military files of men and women who have been injured or lost their homes or lost their jobs, or particularly those who've been executed and others, you will see in almost every case vital money and considerable sums have been provided to families of the dead Republican dead in Ireland by the White Cross, principally out of, I said, New York and Philadelphia, but across Irish America. So at public meetings across the northeastern United States, particularly in New York, you have huge anti-treaty sentiment. There's a little interesting caveat there. John Devoy and other leaders of Clan na Gael despise Eamon de Valera on a personal level due to events in 1920. It's really about egos. All of these guys have big egos. They blame de Valera for the Civil War while supporting the IRA in the Civil War. And it's probably a bit much to get into at this point, but there's always been a more militant approach in Irish America, perhaps, than at home. Because definitely, if a majority of the IRA were anti-treaty, I think it's beyond doubt that in terms of the public opinion, people wanted peace. People did not, whilst they had sympathy with the Republican position, a majority did support the treaty. It was democratically endorsed. So it brings you to a very dangerous point for Republicans, is that are they essentially pushing for a dictatorship? Does the IRA sentiment within the IRA take precedence over democratic sentiment? And this is really what the Free State is arguing, is that Rory O'Connor, I think with some justification in terms of Rory O'Connor, quite frankly, is in favor of the establishment of a dictatorship. That people, the public opinion doesn't matter. What matters is what the IRA thinks, first and foremost. And they're very, very concerned with getting the support of New York, Philadelphia, and Irish America behind that position.
Okay. I guess one last question, just to throw it out there. The involvement of women within the IRA and Sinn Féin and so forth at the time, it's probably not given as much focus as it should be. Any sort of commentary on that?
Yes, so I'll just come in there, Seán. I think that's something that's been redressed maybe in the more recent commemorations, and that it's something that is now being brought to the fore. And O'Connor's work has been important in I suppose illuminating and highlighting women's roles. So women were hugely important on all sorts of levels, on very I suppose very, very basic levels, but women were carrying messages. They were central to the intelligence, and there were often women actually working in post offices who were then intercepting messages and communications with the British. But this actually intensifies in the Civil War. So we mentioned already that the women who were elected to the Dáil all rejected the treaty. And some of this was to do with their connections to leading figures who'd lost their lives in the War of Independence, but also a strong feeling that this wasn't the republic that they had strove for. And we also see it then with commemorating, which is the women's organisation, is the first organisation to officially reject the treaty. And I think that's quite significant that the women are to the fore. But just to bring that back over to Irish America, we see that somewhat similarly in Irish America. So we have a commemorating branch in New York. In Irish America, what we find is that the women are actually quite radical in that they are mingling with other socialist groups, with other feminist groups, and the question of suffrage obviously is hugely important. And at the time, actually, in Dublin, there's a concern, and it's expressed by Jenny Wise Power, who, as it happens, was one of the few women who was pro-treaty. But she expressed her concern that an idea had gone abroad that all the women were anti-treaty. And this is referring to New York, that there was a sense that all of the women were anti-treaty. And we do see that in some of the newspaper reporting, actually, in the States, that there's very much a sense that the women in America could not accept this. And obviously we can unpack that and say there's possibly many examples of women who did support the treaty. But I think what's interesting is if we look at the AOH on a national level, the main organisation supported the treaty, but the Ladies Auxiliary of the AOH, which was led by Mary McWhorter, came out and they opposed the treaty very strongly. So we see that there again, that gender division plays out again in the US, which I think is quite significant. And then another thing just to mention in terms of women in the US is that women are hugely central to the fundraising efforts. And it's both on two levels. It's on a very practical level. We see that women are out there, whether that's the White Cross, whether it's the Bonds, they are out on the streets collecting donations. There's even fantastic news coverages and reports from local committees that say that where men can only get dollars, where men can only get donuts, women can get dollars. And there's a sense that women are much more effective fundraising. And they also send many leading women from Ireland to do US tours, and it proves really successful that these women are highly successful in, I suppose, capturing the public imagination. We have the likes of Mary McSweeney, who spends most of 1921 travelling and speaking of her own experience as well. And they're getting huge crowds all across the States coming to hear their stories. And there's an emotional element to that. They're playing up that gendered emotional element of the brutality that they've witnessed, and also the suffering that they've endured and that their families have endured. So there's the practical element of women on the ground, but there's also, as I said, that gender discourse. And the other thing to mention is within the White Cross and other organisations, they are emphasising that the money is going back to Ireland, to women and children in Ireland. Whether that was always the case is another question, but all of the fundraising is very much tied up to this gendered narrative of war and supporting the most vulnerable in the fundraising. And so definitely a really interesting aspect of this entire period, both in Ireland and here in the US.
Very good. Well, Siobhra, Conor, thank you so much for your time today and insight. Very much appreciated, and a happy Easter to you.
You too, Seán.
Thanks, Seán.
Okay, here we are in Moore Street, something just outside of Bury. The sun is shining, but it's cold. We're 390 something of weeks here now, since September 2014, campaigning beside Moore Street. Here are some of our supporters: Brona, who's actually a founder of the campaign, and Orla, a long-time supporter, and Seán taking photographs there, the video there, is also a supporter. So now I'm going to talk a bit about Moore Street. and about the campaign. So this campaign here is to save Moore Street, which is the oldest street market in Dublin, and also a 1916 battleground. We are an independent campaign. We're not with any party or organisation, and most of us are also individually independent as well. And we've been here, the campaign's been here since 2014, every Saturday for 2 hours with a petition and giving out leaflets about the history of Moore Street. This is the oldest street market in Dublin. It predates the Great Hunger. It was laid out before O'Connell Street, and speculators are trying to demolish most of it and take a road straight through it in order to come out in front of the IAW&A shopping centre across the road, because the speculator owns half the shopping centre as well. So in 1916, on Easter week, the GPO garrison had to abandon the GPO because it was on fire, and a large number of them came here. Some of them charged up the road to confront a British barricade at the end. Most of them were shot down or died on the way. O'Reilly, who led the charge, died around the corner up there in Moore Lane, in O'Reilly Parade, which runs between here and Moore Lane. And there's a monument there, but there's been no monument in this street to commemorate what happened here until 1966, when a small plaque was put up on the wall here, about this size. And that plaque disappeared in 2001. Was found in a speculator's office, which he said he had recovered because it had fallen on the ground. And that's how long the campaign has been going. As I said, we've been here since 2014. So the buildings behind us are a terrace in which the volunteers occupied and tunnelled from house to house all the way through on that Friday when they occupied these buildings, because they couldn't go any further. The British barricades were down the end there on Parnell Street, firing down the street here and killing people. This is where the surrender finally took place. 5 of the signatories of the Proclamation of Independence spent their last hours of freedom here, including Connolly, Pearse and Pearse. This market is being run down as well. There used to be 75 stalls here. Now there's normally on the street maybe 5 or 6. There's maybe 15 licenses being issued in whole. As you could see if you were looking here, you would see that there's many people here from other lands. Ireland has often been visited by people from other lands. These ones didn't come here with guns to occupy or oppress us. And in fact, we should remember that in 1916, many of the people who fought here had not been born in Ireland, and some of them were not even Irish at all. Patrick Pearse's father was English. Tom Clark was born in England. James Connolly was born in Edinburgh. So, Paddy Kearney wrote the song, the national anthem, which is called the Soldier Song, and he fought in the Rising. That song was sung in the Rising, but he wrote a lot of other songs as well, including an anti-recruitment song that is quite jocular. So Paddy Kearney was a painter. His nephew Brendan Behan, Brian Behan and Dominic Behan were all writers as well. So this song had only 3 verses and I've added another 2. Sergeant William Bailey had been right around the world, tooraloo-raloo-raloo-raloo, where'er the British Army had their Union Jack unfurled, tooraloo-raloo-raloo-raloo. They were there to do their duty, to rape and take their booty, and rebels they left alive were very few. But in spite of all their civilizing, the natives kept uprising. Ah, poor Sergeant William Bailey, tooraloo. Sergeant William Bailey got tired of cold and heat, tooraloo-raloo-raloo-raloo. The insects and the natives began to have him beat, tooraloo-raloo-raloo-raloo. And he was having premonitions of running out of ammunition, and some rebel with a big sword cutting him in two. He applied to give up shooting, take a turn at the old recruiting, as Sergeant William Bailey, Turlough. And then Sergeant William Bailey was a man of high renown. Turlough. In search of gallant young recruits, he scoured around the town. Turlough. His face was full and swarthy, of medals he had 40, and ribbons on his chest, red, white and blue. Oh, it was he that looked the hero, and he made the people stare, oh, as he stood on Dumpy's corner, Turlough. But alas for human greatness, every doggy has his day. Turlough. And Sergeant William Bailey, he is looking old and grey. Turlough. No longer youth are willing to take his dirty shilling, and things for him is looking mighty blue. In spite of fife and drumming, no more recruits are coming to Sergeant William Bailey, Turlough. And now Sergeant William Bailey is a desperate sight to see. Turlough. His back that was so firm and straight is nearly bent in three. Turlough. And some rebel youths with placards have called his army blackguards and told the Irish youth just what to do. He has lost his occupation, let's sing in jubilation. As Sergeant William Bailey, Turlough.
Hello, happy Easter everyone. Banachtain Akoski, Guléir. So this is the Salon for the War of Independence and remembering all those who died for freedom, for Irish freedom. And this one, of course, is one you'd know by the great James Connolly. It's called Freedom's Pioneers. And usually the air of this is The Boys of Wexford. But I decided to put The Mountains of Pomeroy, which is a great Tyrone song, on this instead, and it was the title of my solo album, the latest one, Freedom's Pioneer. So here we go. Our feet upon the upward path are set where none may tread, save those to the rich man's wrath their turn rebellious head, and have brave no cringing slave in all our ranks of peace, our proudest boast in labour's host of our freedom's pioneers. Our slaves may beg and cowards whine, we scorn their foolish fears. It's our plan to lead the van with freedom's pioneers. To is still the night, and wealth still rules the law. But man shall bow no longer now, but welcome with his cheers. A ringing stroke to break our yoke of freedom's pioneers. All slaves may beg and cowards whine, we scorn their foolish fears. Be this our plan to lead the van with freedom's pioneers. All slaves may beg and cowards whine, we scorn their foolish fears. Be this our plan to lead the van with freedom's pioneers. With freedom's pioneers. We are freedom's pioneers. The great James Connolly wrote that, and I hope you enjoy that one. I will continue with another one if there's time. This one was written and composed by Danny Hannon, born and raised here in the Bronx. Both of his parents were from County Kerry, my county, the Old Kingdom. And he wrote this song when he went to see Nelson Mandela at Yankee Stadium when he was released from prison first, when he got out of Robben Island after spending 27 years in jail. And he came to the old Yankee Stadium, and Danny went to see him, and he was so inspired by him, he wrote this. And it's called Mandela. It's the official title of that song. A lot of people have recorded it and called it The Legend, but Danny's very adamant, and he says it's Mandela. It's a tribute to the great man, great civil rights and human rights leader. And here it is. I went to see a legend just the other night at Yankee Stadium underneath the lights. I heard a man speak there after years and years in jail. His name it was Mandela, and he came to tell his tale. Well, the crowd cheered him loudly, but then silence fell as he spoke of the hard years in a South African cell. And although he was free now, his heart was still in pain, for his country and his people still wore apartheid's chains. He said he hoped that we would join him as we walked down freedom's path, and these miles would be the hardest, but they would be the last. And to join our hands together so that we might be as one, to find ourselves the courage so this battle could be won. I went home that same evening, went to sleep and had a dream. I was standing in a cold rain in an Irish field of green, and all around me headstones of the martyrs of the past. They stood there in silence, and they spoke to me Kevin Barry is my name, and I died in the hangman's noose. They wanted the names of my comrades, but this I would not do. And I am Roger Casement, and I died in London town for bringing German rifles to the lonely Banastra. James Connolly is my name, the working people were my life. When they shot me down in Kilmainham jail, brought great civil strife. And I am Padraig Pearse, and I was murdered by the foe as I read the proclamation from the steps of the GPO. Well, the last voice that I heard said my name is Bobby Sands, and it's good to hear Mandela's words ringing through the land. I hope they hear him up in Belfast and Derry and Tyrone. Maybe then those English soldiers will know it's time to go home. I awoke in the morning, nothing made sense at all. But who would believe they would knock down the Berlin Wall? Well, they freed Nelson Mandela, or could this really be? Maybe now we will see Ireland reunited and free. Maybe now we will see Ireland reunited and free. Thank you. God bless everybody. Take care. Happy Easter.
Hello, everybody. I have Turlough McConnell and Cormac O'Malley with me today. We're going to talk about a subject that people are seemingly unaware of for a lot of people, including myself, the 1922 World Congress of the Irish Race in Paris. I'm going to turn it over to Turlough and Cormac.
Hi there, Sean, and great to see my friend Cormac O'Malley here. We know that we're going to give an idea of this phenomenal exhibition that happened in Paris right at such a critical time in Ireland's history. So the event happened in Paris in January of 1922. And just so that the viewers know that in various spots around the world today, here we are in 2022, this event will be commemorated primarily by the Irish government at a few different locations. One is at an exhibition in Paris, a conference at the Georges Pompidou Center. Also, there's an exhibition at Notre Dame University, at Trinity College in Dublin, and then again later next month in May, Sotheby's will have an auction in Paris connected to many of the artists who were represented back 100 years ago in 1922. But before I drill down into the Paris exhibition, let me just say welcome, Cormac. It's always great to see you. And I know that we're going to try to limit our conversation to about 15 minutes here, just so that, because there's a lot on Sean's program to mark the centennial Salon. Cormac, I believe you're just back from Ireland yourself?
I am, yeah, just back.
Great. And I know that the main reason that I've invited you to talk to us a little bit, because at the exhibition, first of all, let me give the viewers an idea of who attended this Congress in Paris. Sean, if you show the next slide. So there we have a rather grand photograph. And Cormac, you probably know a bunch of the different characters here, but I know that the cursor there, right on the very front row, you have De Valera sitting next to Constance Markovitz. And De Valera was one of 3 Irish presidents who would be presidents of Ireland coming up after this period. You have Douglas Hyde, and you have Sean T. O'Kelly, who came much later, I believe. And you of course got De Valera. The other woman in the front row there at the bottom, at the right-hand side of the picture, is the sister of Terence McSweeney. Because one of the things that the overall Congress was, even though these were all politicians for the most part, except in the very back row there, up there in the very back row on the extreme right is Jack Yates, the painter. So we know that both the Yates brothers, Jack Yates and William Butler Yeats, were at the Congress. We also know that some of the plays of John Millington Synge were also performed at this Congress. But in terms of the sister of Terence McSweeney, who is the martyred mayor of Cork, her brother, there was a musical performance of a chamber orchestra that took place. So for about a week, Ireland's arts and culture was celebrated by these people in Paris. And really what was going on here, it was an opportunity for them to signify that Ireland has a very distinct culture than the United Kingdom, than Britain. And they were very proud of that. And so they gathered the artists like Harry Clarke and Paul Henry and Jack Yates, Sean Keating, to be part of this in what was then the world's capital of art and culture, Paris. But I think, Cormac, just to kind of give us a setting, we know that we had the Anglo-Irish Treaty just earlier in December, a month before, in 1921. So here you had such a defining moment that's kind of between the signing of the treaty and before the outbreak of civil war that was to happen a few months later. So you had this moment of arts and culture taking place in Paris. Cormac, anything you would like to say about the timing of the event?
Well, first of all, Turlough, you and I have been involved in organizing exhibits, and we know how long it takes to plan an exhibit. And indeed, this race Congress brought representations from about 20 different Irish communities all around the former Commonwealth. And they assembled a very large contingent from Argentina, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and they all came here. And this was the photograph there is so remarkable because it's the Irish delegation. Now, that photograph seems very nice and peaceful, but there are people in that photograph who get killed in the forthcoming civil war. Harry Boland is there. Mary McSweeney has already lost her brother. There are others who suffer. And looking at the photograph, it seems also calm. But what's happening back in Ireland is, there was a truce in July 20, leading to the treaty in December, and then just 10 or 15 days before this photograph is taken, there is a vote in the Dáil, a very close vote, which is 64 to 57 in favor of the treaty, and part of the Republicans, the anti-treaty people, walk out with De Valera, and a new government is elected right away. And yet, the calmness behind this photograph is as if nothing were happening. Everyone looks grim, but that's the way photographs were taken in those days. So you have no idea about what each person is thinking. But clearly, to see, as Turlough mentioned, Douglas Hyde, John T. O'Kelly, De Valera, Owen McNeill, all sitting in a row, so to speak, along with the great ladies. It's a dramatic photograph, and one which is the peacefulness of this photograph is about to explode on the Irish setting within a couple of months.
Yeah, I mean, that's remarkable. Well, I know we could do a film on this one photograph alone. Seán, let's see the next photo up, which is a more of it. This is just a closer one with Dev and Markovitz and McSweeney. But it's kind of one of the things. The reason that I'm so focused on this exhibition and these artists in Paris at that time, and Cormac, and the reason I shared with you is because I'm so conscious that some of the artists who will be mentioning are artists who are represented at the Ireland's Great Hunger Museum at Quinnipiac, who tragically are shuttered today and we can't see them. When you think that here we are celebrating the importance of Irish art around the world, between Notre Dame and Paris and what have you, and here we have in Connecticut a museum we can't get into that has these very same artists. And one of the things that is in the exhibition at Quinnipiac, Markovitz, her main thing in the Paris event, other than being the amazing political leader that she was she was very, very keen on making sure that she would challenge the whole idea that was at that point being run in the British magazines about the Irish being less than socially civilized. And we have all of the cartoons from the Illustrated London News at Quinnipiac, which is the theme that she was hitting on hard at the time. I think it's also interesting to note that in this very year of 1922, there was another cultural phenomenon just down the road from where this exhibition was happening. And that was, if you go to the next slide, Seán, that was our own James Joyce. James Joyce is here with Sylvia Beach at Shakespeare and Company, and they had just published Ulysses, which we know that one book alone has really resonated around the world and continues. So in this moment of 1922, you had all of these artists, you had writers, you had, of course, Joyce, and you had Beckett, who was coming behind all of them, just in terms of telling Ireland's story through its art and culture. Beyond that, I think that, I think our next shot up is, if you go to the next slide, is one of the artists who I wanted to single out, and that's the young Jack Yates. Jack Yates, who Samuel Beckett has said became the great painter of Ireland that he is, and he's known as Beckett said, because he captured light better than anyone. And but this was remarkable. This was the only time that Jack Yates ever spoke in public about art. And I happened to come across a wonderful book by Bruce Arnold, who you probably know, Cormac. Bruce wrote the wonderful book on Jack Yates, and he goes into depth about what Yates said at the time. We don't have time to talk about it now, but I think it's important to start referencing Yates and the painting that he showed in Paris at that time. If you go to the next slide, Seán, was this painting here. And it was a painting called Bachelor's Walk. And the woman in this painting represented Ireland, was represented Kathleen Houlihan. And that child looking forward into the future was the new nation looking forward, because Yates was painting this at the height of, after 1916. And this was symbolic. He had a show of his paintings in New York at the time, and they were very, very, quite phenomenal. I want to mention that this is just an aside, but it's important. While both of the Yates brothers were in New York, Jack Yates and John Yates, William Butler Yeats, their dad, John Yates, was living in Chelsea in New York. as the guest of the great John Quinn, the lawyer and collector, and our good friend, Patricia Hardy, who's the editor and publisher of Irish American magazine. John Yates had just died around this time, and a painting that he had been working on in New York, Patricia was to discover. And if you go to the next slide there, I'll show you the picture of, this is Patricia with a painting of John Yates, the father, which he had been working on in New York for several years. Now, John Yates, it's hard to see what a master painter he was and is. This painting, thanks to Patricia, is now at the National Gallery in Dublin, and along with many other paintings done by the senior John Yates. But this family was phenomenal in that, right from the father and the two sons and the daughters were all involved in the arts. But that leads me into the next slide. If you just bring up the next slide. So here's a slide of the young Ernie O'Malley on the right, I believe is taken by your mother, Cormac, that wonderful photograph, and the elder Jack Yates. And these men were, even though they were different ages, I think they died within a couple of days of each other.
Right.
But they were great, great friends. Cormac, talk a little bit about their friendship.
Well, father would have been quite familiar with Yeats's work from an earlier period, and even when he was in the forecourts, when it was taken in June of 1922, he remarks in his memoir, The Singing Flame, that a bullet had landed in the 1904 book by John Millington Synge and Jack Yates about their trip through Connemara. And he'd made the comment, something to the effect that maybe the staters didn't like Yates. Anyway, so by the time my father finally returns to Ireland in 1935, he meets up with Yates in about 1937, and they become friends, social friends, and then my father starts buying some of his paintings, of which he is greatly enamored. And they mean a lot not only to Jack Yates, but also to my father as sort of representing the soul of Ireland in painting. And one of the things he wanted to do coming back from America was help bring a modern soul and the opportunity for Ireland to get its own art rather than a received British art. And so Jack Yates, I think, was the epitome of this.
And on that note, Cormac, Sean, let's see the next slide. This is the slide. This is the painting, Derrynane, which, thanks to you, Cormac, is in the collection of the Great Hunger at Quinnipiac. Tell us a little bit about this painting. Did your dad acquire this painting from? I know that this was painted in 1929. Did your dad acquire that in the early days?
No, my father only started collecting art. Well, he didn't have money at the time. His first book was On Another Man's Wound, which is published in 1936. So he started getting some royalties from that, and he also started getting his pension and disability pension from the IRA, from the Irish government in 1935-36. So basically, he sort of allocated his limited funds to buying art and books and carrying on that side of his life, of the family life. The first painting that he bought was on another man. Was Death for Only One. This painting of Derrynane, most all of my father's paintings, purchases were of Western scenes. So even though this is Kerry, it is typical of the Yeatsian scene. You can see Skellig in the background. You can see the sea, which Yeats loved, and the land around. This is Daniel O'Connell's territory down in Kerry. So my father bought a series of paintings in the late 30s and early 40s, and this is one of them.
And one of the things I read in Bruce Arnold's book was that Jack Yates always said, the two things you can never go wrong painting are jaunting cars and sailing ships. And I know we've got a sailing ship in there, but it is significant because this is the actual home of Daniel O'Connell in County Kerry. So that was very significant. The other, and Cormac, it must sadden you greatly to think that we can't see this painting because it's locked up at Quinnipiac.
Yeah, I mean, you know, these paintings were acquired by Quinnipiac for purposes of having an exhibit of the Great Famine, and you know, for several years now they have been shuttered, which is a real shame. And I hope that you know they become unshattered. However, we can arrange that. But
right. Well, I think that'll be another program, and I can say that the Attorney General of Connecticut is on the case, and we are watching very closely to make sure that all of the collection is handled properly. There's speaking of that, there's another painter who's also in the collection, but if you show the next slide here, Sean, this is a painting here by the great Paul Henry, and it's this was a painting that they showed in Paris in 1922. And this painting was bought by the French government. And it's in the Georges Pompidou Center in Paris. And around this painting, they will have the conference this year to mark the centennial. But also, if you go to the next slide, Sean, this painting here, called Cottages West of Ireland, this painting is one of the shuttered paintings at Quinnipiac, which, you know, demands to be seen. So hopefully we'll get to see it again someday. As I mentioned earlier, there are events happening around the world about this centennial. The next slide shows the poster, and it's and this was a remarkable painting here by the great Sean Keating. And this is in the O'Brien collection. And the O'Brien collection, most of the paintings at Notre Dame University on display in commemoration of the centennial are from the O'Brien collection, along with a great collection of music. The curator is Marty Fahey, who is the curator of the O'Brien collection, also a great traditional Irish musician. So the focus is on music and art. And they another painting they have is, go to the next one. This is a painting. This is actually inside the Quinnipiac Museum, the Great Hunger Museum. And that painting, very large painting on the ground there, is by Michael Farrell. And he's one of the artists represented at the Snyde Collection at the University of Notre Dame, as is the next one. If you bring up the next slide, this is by a painter, an Irish painter who's a phenomenal painter these days, working mostly in England and Ireland. His name is Hughie O'Donoghue, and I met him a couple of years ago. And he said all of his work, this painting is in the Quinnipiac Museum, is called On Our Knees. And this painting is, he said all of his work is very influenced by the famine, and his grandmother's recitation of stories to him as a child about the famine years. So very, very important. And, you know, I just want to wrap up now because I'm aware of Sean's time in terms of his program, and just show the last picture, last slide here. This is the poster for the upcoming auction in Paris on May 9th. So get your checkbooks out, head over to Paris, and start looking at Irish art that's going to be on sale there. But more importantly, let's all keep our focus on reopening the Quinnipiac Museum, the Great Hunger Museum, so we can see some of these wonderful artists who are being celebrated around the world and should be celebrated more locally in Connecticut. Cormac, thanks for being on our program. And Sean, thank you for giving us the opportunity to remember the story in Paris in 1922.
Turlough and Cormac, thank you both for being on here and giving your time and insight. And let's hope this, you know, we can actually persevere with the museum. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
God bless.
Now the old house was still. Comely Bessie Ballynoy on her way up had knocked. Finding Seán in bed, a big good night and gone. A lazy sleep crawled in by the dark hallway to soothe restlessness, and to hush the clamour from the attic above to the basement below. A lousy sleep, dreary-eyed, in loosely slippered feet, torn and muddy, calling in a shoddy whisper for quietness. Creeping in, yawning, leaving no one on watch, even though every night now was a perilous night for Dublin. In all the rooms, all the cheap crockery stood quiet on shelves, chairs leaned against shaky walls, rosy-faced fires had all gone pale. Only dreams crept, slowly in to fill the ugly rooms with sparkling peace for a few dark moments, clothing the sleepers with a cautious splendour, setting them maybe to sip rare wines from bulging bottles, or leading them to yellow sands bordering a playful sea. Younger lass perhaps, dream of scanty night attire between snowy sheets, with a colour-rolled prince by the bedroom door in a haste to come in and bid her a choice good night, while the younger men saw themselves, sword in hand, driving the khaki cutthroats out of Eir's 5 beautiful fields, every guardian angel relaxed now, and nodded sleepily by tattered counterpane and ragged sheet, for sin usually curled up like a dog to sleep at their feet, waiting for tenement life to go again in the morning. So after curfew, the silent tenement slept. It was unconscious even, that every whine and wail of every passing motor car sang a song of death for someone. For in sleep, the slimy roof above them had slid aside, and left the stars but a hand's breadth out of reach. When will the day break in Máirtín? When will our day start to rise? How often had he heard these words sang in a languishing voice after an 8-hand reel or a high-call cap at a Kinealy? Well, no day would ever break here, nor would the shadows ever flee away. Seán's eyes were closing. Dim thoughts swam faintly from his mind into the humming whine of motor engines coming along the road outside, up onto his elbow he shot, as he heard the screech of brake, telling him that the lorries were outside of his house, or of those on either side. Then he shot down again, to hide, as a blinding beam from a searchlight poured through the window, skimming the cream of the darkness out of the room. It silvered the old walls for a few moments, then withdrew, like a receding tide to send its beam on another part of the house. Then there was a volley of battering blows at the obstinate wooden door, mingled with the crash of falling glass that told Seán the panels on either side of it had been smashed by a hammer or rifle butt. It read. All the winsome dreams of the house had vanished. Sleep had gone, and children dug arms and legs into the tensing bodies of their mothers. But which way? The Tommies or the Tans? Tans, thought Seán, for the Tommies would not shout so soullessly, nor smash the glass panels so suddenly. They'd hammer on the door with a rifle butt. They'd wait for it to be opened. No, these were Tans. He heard the quick pit-put of stocking feet faint as it was coming down the stairs, turning left at the bottom of them and hurrying down the hall towards the backyard. His ears were so cocked that he heard the soft silky pad of the hurrying feet, plainly through the storm of blows falling on the door. Then he thought he heard the back door open, softly and gently close again. Who could that be, he thought? Might be any of the men. Those who didn't take part in ambushes often carried ammunition to those who did, and the dockers and seamen gave a ready hand to the smuggling in of arms. Sure, if it wasn't for his own poor sight, he'd probably be doing it himself. All were friendly, save the thin and delicate husband of Miss Ballynoy. He cared for no manner of politics. But someone anyhow, slipping into the back to dodge over the wall into the dark lanes, With fear, but without fuss. The Dublin slums at war with the British Empire. All the power of an army, flanked by gangs of ruthless ruffians. All the ordered honour of a regal cabinet and the mighty moneyed banks, fighting the ragged gits of the tenements. An unequal fight, by God, but the slums would win. There goes the door. A great crash shook the whole house, and shook the heart of Seán. For well he knew the ordeal that might be in front of him once the light from a Tan's torch smoked the darkness of the room. A mad rush of heavy feet went past his door, spread over the stilly house, for no one had come from any room, and risked sudden death in a dark and draughty hallway. You remembered the two boys brought bound from Dublin Castle to a dumbfield on the edge of the city by two Occitan officers, who set them sitting against an old stone wall, extinguishing each young head under an old bucket picked from a rubbish heap. Fancy Clown and McKee, caught and brought to the castle where the Tans interviewed them with the stimulant of bayonets prodding them gamely, till none of the three could sigh any longer, for each at last was dead. Now we could hear neither sound nor murmur. All had gone quiet after the crash and fall of the door. No sound even of a child's protest, though that wasn't surprising, for all of them would be too frightened to squeal. All was quiet. The sad silence of a sleeping slum. Yet Seán knew that the house must be alive with crawling men, slinking up and down the stairs, hovering outside this door or that one, each with a gun tense to the last hair with a ready finger touching the trigger. He guessed that a part of them were Aussies, the classic members of sibilant and sinister raiders. The Tans alone would have made more noise, slamming themselves into a room, shouting to shake off the fear. You could see it slashed across many of their faces. Aussies, too proud to show a sign of it. The Tommies would be warm, always hesitant on knocking a woman's room about. You'd even be jocular in that funny English way, encouraging the women, and even the children, to grumble at being taken away from their proper sleep. All Seán could do was try to be dead still, digging down deeper without sound into the hard mattress of his truckle bed, stifling any desire to steal to the doorway to listen, trying to modify his breathing till it became unnoticed even by himself, for the profound silence might make the Tans disinclined to probe a way in to find out the cause of it, though the Aussies cared nothing for silence. They didn't lift the corpse from a coffin to search for a gun. He always left his door unlocked now. The past experiences had shown that the slightest obstacle to the swift entrance to a room always irritated them.
I hope you all had a great time this afternoon, evening. I want to thank all of our contributors for the Salon for their time and their insight. So a big Garamel Amagat to you all. Also, I want to send a special thank you to Chris Corcoran of Blue Sky Studios, who's not only a great friend, but a talented videographer for his work in compiling all of these videos. Slán go fóill, happy Easter to all.